Well, we're continuing with Philip Simmons' book, Learning to Fall, The Blessings of an Imperfect Life. And today we are at the second to last chapter, chapter 11, which is called Returning Home. 2 nights ago, the wind was up, the first real blow of December with 70 miles per hour gusts. At the first flicker of the lights, we filled the bathtub with water. And by the time we were plunged into blackness, just after dinner, we were ready with flashlights and candles. We staggered to bed early, the kids bedded down on the living room floor by the wood stove, and we woke with big pines down across the road. This is how we dance with chaos. We change batteries and store water. We read bedtime stories to our children. We keep the chainsaw sharp, not knowing which trees or when, only that they will fall. I'd like to think there's some value in being reminded that there's only so much we can control. I think of Robert Frost's lines. The tree the tempest with a crash of wood throws down in front of us is not to bar our passage to our journey's end for good, but just to ask us who we think we are. Lately, I've been given plenty of reason to reflect on such surprises. After sticking it out as long as I could, I finally had to give up my college teaching career in the Midwest and return for good to this one blinking light town in New Hampshire's White Mountains, the place of my boyhood summers, where my parents now live full-time, and which, in some unnameable inner sense, I have never really left. My returning home in this way is not the end of my journey, not yet, but a sudden detour, a surprise, certainly. In some ways, I'm astonished at my good fortune. Who could have expected, after all, that in my early 40s I would be living a sort of gentleman's retirement in the country, with time to read philosophy, raise chickens, and supervise my children's piano practice. Each morning, I watch the sunrise, a little later and a little farther south, yet filling my house with light. Hoarfrost glitters in the fields. My wife makes coffee. My children make their beds. Who could complain? And yet, these are hardly the terms under which I had hoped to receive such a bounty. I'm in a chair with wheels. I no longer can raise my arms in joy. But who among us gets to dictate the terms of his or her good fortune? You can't live very long on this earth without confronting a fundamental truth. We're not in charge here, at least not entirely so. Our greatest blessings, along with our greatest burdens, seem to fall upon us unbidden. For all our planning, for all our talk of goals, for all our strategy and vision and commitment, we learn that many of our lives' most important events can't be predicted or controlled. All the plans we are in the business of making are continually being upset by both disaster and delight. How many of us could have predicted when we first set out from our parents' homes for college or work or marriage, either our achievements or our disappointments? For how many of us has life turned out to be exactly what we had in mind? All of us have at some point faced that tree fallen across the road. All of us have been forced to ask who we think we are. We have lost jobs, marriages, health. We've seen friends fail and bodies wither. With each loss, the trap door opens beneath our feet and we fall, feeling the terrible wind, gazing upward at a life now forever out of reach. Last spring, while we were packing for our move here from Illinois, I lived surrounded by boxes, seeing an entire stretch of my life hauled or thrown away. I found myself asking, what here abides? The home is always on some level an embodiment of the self, and mine was being emptied. In the midst of change, what lasts? Of course, traditional religion has ready answers like this one from St. Paul. We know that if the earthly house we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. But many of us these days don't accept Paul's vision, at least not literally. Even my computer appears skeptical. Because I have trouble typing, I use speech dictation software. And when I said a house eternal in the heavens, the words appeared on my screen as eternal in the Hamptons. Now, some of us might prefer a house in the Hamptons to an eternity of white robes and harp lessons. And many of us doubtless find it more likely that we'll end up in the Hamptons than with the sort of house described by Paul. But even if we don't accept Paul's vision literally, his words still challenge us to imagine what home of ours will last. We seek continually to return home, in the face of disaster and delight, in the face of all that calls and keeps us away. We seek that sure ground of our being and our doing, the home that withstands the vagaries of time and chance and change. At the very least, we feel entitled to something more than the home Robert Frost defines mischievously as the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. But spiritual problems are never resolved, only transcended. And in the end, we return home by recognizing that we're already there. Indeed, our true home is within. As the Stoic Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Look within. Within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if thou wilt ever dig." Finding this fountain of goodness within us, we discover that no land is foreign. No matter where we go, we are never strangers. We return home to the place we never left. I know this is easier said than done. Perhaps no feeling is more common in us than the feeling of being alone and estranged, far from the home of our fond imaginings. To some, this is the meaning of the story of our expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Our exile from God, from our divine selves, from the true nature of things, from our heart of hearts, comes as our birthright, as the cost of our precious humanness. Feeling our estrangement, we continually yearn for home, and each of the world's religions teaches its own way of getting there. This journey home is illustrated beautifully in the Old Testament book of Ruth. You may remember the story. In a time of famine, Naomi leaves the Jewish homeland of Judah, settling in Moab with her husband and 2 sons. Eventually, her sons marry Moabite women. Then comes Naomi's windstorm. Her trees fall out across the road. Her husband and sons all die. Naomi, bereft and far from her people, decides to return to her homeland, urging her daughters-in-law to return to your mother's houses. The daughters-in-law protest, for they have come to love Naomi and don't want to leave her. One of the women does eventually return to her family, but the other, Ruth, refuses. Her words to Naomi are among the Bible's most fondly remembered lines. "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." The story ends happily. Naomi and Ruth journey together to Naomi's homeland in Judah, contrive to marry Ruth off to Boaz, a good and wealthy kinsman of Naomi's. And at the story's end, Ruth bears Naomi's first grandson, said to be the grandfather of King David, and thus, according to a later tradition, an ancestor of Jesus. It's a beautiful story of love and fidelity, of the ways new families can be formed out of misfortune. Further, Ruth's story is part of a larger development within the history told by the Hebrew Bible, which traces the evolving relationship between a people and its God. Ruth is not born a Jew, but chooses to become one. Once the God of only a small desert band and one God among many in the region, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is developing into something else altogether. The God of all creation and of all people, the home to which anyone may choose to return. We may not believe in the personal deity that the ancient Jews believed in. For us, God may be love, the spirit of life, the creative power that works within us and in all things in every moment, our divine self, or the ground of our being. Whatever our personal concept of God, or indeed whatever our confusions about this subject, we can learn from Ruth's journey. Ruth is said to return with Naomi to Judah. But of course, it's only Naomi who is actually returning. Biblical scholar Robert Alter argues that the writer of the book of Ruth plays on the word return to suggest the deeper meaning of Ruth's journey. Ruth was born in Moab and is journeying to a land she has never seen. Can we return to a place we've never been? Only if that place is within us. Jewish history is marked by journeys. Abraham's original journey into the desert, the journey of Moses and his people out of Egypt, the Jews' return from their Babylonian exile. As this history develops, we come increasingly to understand these outward physical journeys in terms of their inward spiritual dimension. Ruth's story presents her as a person of character, courage, and love, who meets her life's crises with steadfast faith. She has always lived close to that fountain of good within. Thus, Ruth can return home to Judah, home to God, because it's a place she has never left. In our lives, we return home again and again. Each challenge, each crisis, each dislocation gives us a chance to renew the journey. Of course, it may not seem so wonderful at the time. If I repeatedly bang my thumb with a hammer, I may not be very grateful for it, even if it gets me to improve my carpentry skills in the long run. Too often, the repeated challenges and hardships of our lives seem mere repetition without advancement. We've all been through times when everything's going right. We're in the right relationship and the right job. Our kids are eating their Brussels sprouts. Our meditations are yielding extraordinary insight and serenity. Then, wham! Down comes the hammer on the thumb, and everything we thought we were doing right goes suddenly, horribly wrong. A certain amount of this is inevitable. Life, after all, is a messy business, and there's a natural ebb and flow to the process of growing up and learning what it means to be human. Still, we'd like to think we're not going in circles. What's needed is a structure for our spiritual life, some container to keep our growing awareness from dribbling away. As John Tarrant writes in The Light Inside the Dark, everything new needs to be held, needs a place into which it can be born. The name of this container is character, he writes. Character, Tarrant says, is the vessel in which to hold, quote, our swirling selves, end quote. We do not have a say in all that befalls us, but we do have a say in the shape of our own character. Too often these days when we hear someone speaking of the need for character, it's a preacher or politician wanting to impose a particular list of thou shalt nots on others. When I hear such talk, I'm reminded of lectures delivered by my high school's vice principal, a former pro football lineman who had redeployed his body-crushing talents toward the moral improvement of adolescents. Character, too often, is something others feel we must have beaten into us. Truth is, much of our character is under no one's control, but is shaped haphazardly by our families, our communities, and our culture, not to mention the genetic roll of the dice by which we're made to begin with. But increasingly, as we reach adulthood, we come to see character as a matter of choice. We choose practices and principles that shape our character, building either a sound vessel or a weak one. To Aristotle, for instance, choosing friends is a defining act of character or ethos. We choose friends whose qualities we wish to develop or preserve in ourselves. In our daily work, in our roles as caregivers and providers, in our manner of receiving the gifts and good works of others, we can be disciplined or not, mindful or not, responsible and responsive or not, but always our actions both shape and are shaped by the vessel of character. And traditionally, religious faith and spiritual practice are thought to strengthen this vessel, creating a sound container for our developing relationship to mystery, suffering, and the divine. Life throws things at us that we cannot predict and cannot control. What we can control is who we are along the way. We can, like Ruth, control how much energy, compassion, and integrity we bring to our journey. We've all heard of the sudden millionaires, the lottery winners whose lives have gone haywire. And we know others on whom success has hardened like a shell, sealing them off from friends and family. These examples teach us that it's not just bad news that carries us away from ourselves. Good fortune can threaten our integrity too. An old Buddhist story tells of the seeker who, after years of instruction and meditation, goes on a pilgrimage high in the mountains, where at last he has a transforming vision that heralds his enlightenment. Full of excitement, he returns to his teacher to tell of the wonderful thing that has befallen him. The teacher, a man of many years and hard-won wisdom, replies, "Don't worry, you'll get over it." What we're after is equanimity, the poise that allows us to accept gracefully the blessings and burdens that are beyond our control. What we're after is the ability, regardless of circumstance, in the face of disappointment and happy surprise, in the face of tragedy and bliss, to return home to our true selves and our highest natures. According to a Yiddish saying, "Man trachts und Gott lacht's." Man plans and God laughs. That doesn't mean we stop planning, even though sometimes things get pretty comic. Here's 48 hours in our household last spring. My wife and I have offered to teach summer school classes to make enough money to pay the moving van. The registrar calls to tell us we've got enough students signed up for the classes to run, and we're feeling pretty good. But then the moving company gives us an estimate, $1,000 over our budget. We're cast down. That night the phone rings. Someone offers my wife part-time teaching in New Hampshire. We're raised up. The next day she gets a call back from a second person locked in a departmental war with the first. The course has been canceled and we're once again into the pit. We get a second estimate on the moving, $1,000 less than the first. We break out the party hats and noisemakers. Later that day, the second moving guy calls back. He's made an error, and now it's $1,500 more. We eat ashes for dinner. A letter arrives in the mail. Someone has insisted on paying me $1,000 for a job I said I would do for free. We sign up for hula dancing lessons. The next morning, my wife takes the car into the shop to have it checked out for our trip. And guess what? I hear God laughing. And yet, we keep on planning. How can we do otherwise? There's more at stake here than balancing our checkbooks and paying the bills. For that matter, there's more at stake than our personal happiness or spiritual growth. As ethical beings, We're called to improve the lives of others, our children, and our communities. A vocation that requires not simply accepting things as they are, but imagining something better and working toward it. But here's the paradox. We must strive toward goals, but at the same time, let them go. For as the Buddhists say, it is our very attachment that makes us suffer. Seekers of spiritual advancement have long known the danger of wanting something too badly. The Zen Buddhist places meditation at the heart of spiritual practice, and yet Zen master Shunryo Suzuki teaches that, quote, if our practice is only a means to attain enlightenment, there's actually no way to attain it, end quote. In characteristic Zen fashion, Suzuki claims that, quote, when you give up, when you no longer want something, or when you do not try to do anything special, then you do something, end quote. Equally hard on Western ears are the teachings of Lao Tzu, quote, when nothing is done, nothing is left undone. The world is ruled by letting things take their course, end quote. But how can we do that? How can we do nothing when so much around us needs to be done? How can we have goals yet not grasp them too tightly? We want lives of steady purpose, lives that matter. We want to know who we are and where we're going. How can we do that while remaining open to possibility, to change, to disappointment, and surprise? What might such a life look like? I'm not sure exactly, but hitchhiking comes to mind. Anyone who's done much of it knows that the hitchhiking goes best when you're not in a hurry. So I don't mean the sweaty and breathless hitchhiking you do when your car breaks down on the way to a business meeting, though I've done that kind too. I'm thinking of the kind I did one day when I hitchhiked from Montreal back home to New Hampshire. This was another fall, another return home. I had just finished college, and I'd been traveling for 5 months, through the desert Southwest, up the California coast, and all the way to Seattle, then to Alaska, and finally, with winter on my heels, back across Canada by train. Having spent most of the night and all of my Canadian money drinking beer and playing poker on the train, I arrived just after dawn in the heart of Montreal, broke and tired and needing to get to the city outskirts. I looked at a map on the wall of the train station, took a compass reading, and started walking. Several hours later, relying on my compass and my bad high school French, I reached a place where I could hold up my cardboard sign, my destination neatly printed in black marker, and catch my first ride of the day. Hitchhiking requires that you take what comes, that you learn to be sociable with all sorts of people, and that you be ready for delay and detour. In fact, if you're doing it in the proper spirit, there's no such thing as delay or detour. In the Tao of hitchhiking, there is no distinction between detour and the straight path, and likewise no distinction between an hour spent here or an hour spent anywhere else. This isn't to say one loses sight of the destination. A firm destination gives the journey the structure and rigor that distinguish traveling from wandering. Hence, my cardboard signs lettered neatly with the marker I carried in my pack. But you learn, when hitchhiking, not to grasp your destination too firmly, lest you miss the journey. I was continually rewriting those cardboard signs or throwing them away. And for one stretch of the California coast, I simply held out a large piece of cardboard cut in the shape of a gigantic fist with extended thumb. So it was fitting that some 14 hours after walking out of Montreal, I caught the last ride of my 10,000-mile journey, holding up a cardboard sign that was perfectly blank. And it was also fitting that I didn't make it home that night, but got dropped off near midnight to spend the next 2 hours walking in the utter blackness of an untraveled country road, until I lay down in a pasture, still several miles from home, aligned my body with the Milky Way, and slept until dawn. That autumn's return proved to be one of many, and now I find myself here again, amid white pines and moonlight, 20 years older but still waiting for snow, and still practicing the art of returning home. I have a friend here in town who's a potter, and one day last summer, he showed us how to make a pot. You start by slapping a lump of clay on the wheel and centering it so that it spins smoothly. To shape the clay, you press the spinning lump between your palms, gouge your thumbs into its center, and pull the whole mass toward you so the clay's rotation is no longer centered on the wheel, but on the space between your hands. Squeezing between thumb and foretips, you pull upward from base to rim, pulling the pot into form, and then gently releasing it to spin smoothly on the wheel again. In a master's hands, it takes 3 pulls to form a pot. And the hardest part, my friend explained, is learning how to let the clay go each time. You must let go and let the clay find the center of the wheel. If you try to force it there, the pot will wobble. This is the rhythm of our lives. We need the pulling, the striving. We need to be shaped by life. We need to be deformed so that we may return to form. For we are not angels, but men and women of clay. All of us will be pulled off center. We will be shaped by both disaster and delight. So we need to learn the art of returning home, returning to center, letting go of all that binds us too tightly to both fear and hope, letting go of our attachment to both doom and reward, letting go of all that leaves us wobbling. When we learn to return home in this way, we will return bearing gifts. Chapter 11, Returning Home, of Philip Simmons, Learning to Fall, the Blessings of an Imperfect Life. Next, the last chapter, 12. See you then.